My uncle was a Navy SEAL and refused to go near the ocean after retirement. He finally told me what pulled his team underwater. My Uncle Garrett died 3 weeks ago in his landlocked Montana cabin, 800 miles from the nearest coastline. The official report said heart attack, but I know better now. I know what really killed him, what had been slowly killing him for the past 19 years since he left the Navy. He was 52 when he died, which seems young until you understand that he'd been living on borrowed time since 2004, running from something that should have taken him back then. I'm his nephew Michael, and I'm writing this down because Garrett made me promise I would, made me swear on our family name that I'd document everything he told me during those final days when the morphine wasn't enough to keep the nightmares away, and he finally broke his silence about what happened during Operation Serpent's Cradle. That's not the mission's real name, obviously. It's been redacted and classified and buried under so many layers of government denial that even mentioning it probably puts me on some kind of list. But Garrett said that's what they called it among themselves. A joke that stopped being funny the moment they hit the water. I should probably start by explaining who Garrett was before that mission, before whatever happened in those depths changed him into the paranoid recluse who spent his final years barricading himself in Montana's wilderness. He'd been the golden child of our family, the one everyone pointed to as proof that hard work and dedication could take you anywhere. High school valedictorian, Division I wrestler, accepted to Annapolis before deciding that wasn't elite enough and going straight for Bud S training instead. He made it through Hell Week when 80% of his class rang out, earned his trident, got assigned to SEAL Team 3, and deployed to Iraq during the height of the conflict. My dad, his older brother, used to say that Garrett was born without fear, that he had ice water in his veins and could stare down death without blinking. I remember visiting him once when I was 12, right before his second deployment, and he'd seemed larger than life, tanned and muscular, and radiating confidence that made everyone around him stand a little straighter. He'd talked about the Navy like it was his calling, his purpose, the thing he was meant to do with his existence. Then came 2004 and Operation Serpent's Cradle, and when Garrett came back 6 months later, he was a different person entirely. Not in obvious ways at first, not in ways that made the Navy brass concerned enough to deny his request for early discharge. He still looked physically capable, still had the build and the bearing of an operator, but something fundamental had shifted in his eyes. Some essential piece of him had been scooped out and replaced with a hollow wariness that never went away. He stopped talking about the Navy, stopped responding to messages from his old team members, turned down invitations to reunions and memorial services. Most notably, he moved to Montana and refused to go anywhere near large bodies of water. Not just the ocean, but lakes, rivers, even swimming pools made him visibly uncomfortable. My dad tried to get him to go fishing once, their old bonding activity from childhood, and Garrett had a full-blown panic attack just looking at the lake. After that, everyone in the family learned not to push, not to ask questions, to just accept that Garrett had his reasons and we should respect them. For 19 years, that's how things stayed. Garrett living alone in his cabin working odd jobs and construction gigs that kept him busy, and the rest of us pretending not to notice how he'd check every window 3 times before bed, or how he'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. I visited him occasionally, maybe twice a year, driving up from Denver where I worked as a software engineer. The visits were always strange, Garrett clearly happy to see family but also tense, like he was waiting for something to happen, for some invisible timer to run out. His cabin was in serious isolation, no neighbors for 5 miles in any direction, no internet, barely any cell service. He had a ham radio setup that he monitored obsessively, and shelves full of canned goods, like he was preparing for an apocalypse that only he knew was coming. I asked him once, maybe 8 years ago, why he lived like this, what he was so afraid of. He'd looked at me with those hollow eyes and said that I should be grateful I didn't know, that ignorance was the only real protection any of us had. The call came on a Saturday morning in early November, my mom's voice shaking as she told me that Garrett had collapsed and been rushed to the hospital in Kalispell. By the time I made the 6-hour drive, he'd already been diagnosed with acute heart failure, his cardiac muscle showing damage patterns that the doctors said looked like he'd been under extreme stress for years. They gave him maybe 2 weeks, offered to make him comfortable. Garrett refused hospitalization, signed himself out against medical advice, and had me drive him back to his cabin. During that drive, he was quiet, staring out the window at the passing landscape with an expression that looked almost relieved. When I asked him what he was thinking, he said he was surprised he'd made it this long, that he'd expected something else to get him years ago. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, assumed it was the morphine talking. I helped him into bed, made sure his pain medication was within reach, and prepared to spend the next however long watching my uncle die slowly in this isolated cabin. That first night, he was restless, tossing and turning despite the medication, mumbling things I couldn't quite make out. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to him screaming, not the usual nightmare sounds I'd heard before, but something raw and terrified that made my skin crawl. I rushed into his room and found him sitting up in bed, eyes wide, pointing at the window. "It's here," he kept saying. "It's finally here. It found me." I looked at the window and saw nothing but darkness and pine trees, told him he was safe, that he was just having a bad dream. But Garrett grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said that it wasn't a dream, that he'd been running for 19 years and now time was up. He looked at me with complete lucidity, despite the pain medication, and asked if I wanted to know the truth about what happened during Operation Serpent's Cradle, about why he'd spent nearly 2 decades hiding in the mountains, about what was coming for him now that he was too weak to run anymore. I told him yes, of course I wanted to know. I'd wanted to know for years what had broken him so completely. He studied my face for a long moment, and then said that once he told me, I'd be in danger too, that knowing about it seemed to attract its attention somehow. He said 3 other members of his team had already died in the years since the mission, all of them in ways that looked like accidents but weren't, and that he'd stayed alive only by isolating himself and never speaking about what they'd seen. But he was dying anyway now, and he couldn't take the secret to his grave, couldn't let it disappear without someone knowing what was down there in the dark water, what might still be down there waiting. He asked me if I was willing to accept that risk, to carry this knowledge knowing it might cost me everything. I should have said no, should have told him to keep his secrets and die in peace. But I was young and curious, and I loved my uncle, and I couldn't let him face death alone with these horrors trapped inside him. So I said yes. I wanted to know. I needed to know. Garrett took a long, ragged breath and began talking, and for the next 3 hours I listened to him describe things that shouldn't exist, things that violate every law of physics and biology I've ever learned. I've tried to write down everything exactly as he told me, including the parts that make no sense, the parts that my rational mind wants to reject as the delusional ramblings of a dying man on too much morphine. But I saw the fear in his eyes when he talked, saw the scars on his body that proved at least parts of his story were physically real. And most convincingly, I've seen what's been happening since he died, the things that have been following me, watching me, the same way they watched him for 19 years. So here it is, Garrett's story, the truth about Operation Serpent's Cradle, and what the Navy found in the depths near the Mariana Trench in the summer of 2004. The mission had started routine enough, Garrett said, at least as routine as anything involving Navy SEALs could be. His team, 8 operators plus their commander Lieutenant Xavier Brightwell, had been deployed on a fast attack submarine for what they'd been told was a reconnaissance operation in the Western Pacific. The official briefing said they were going to investigate anomalous sonar readings near an underwater geographic feature called the Serpent's Cradle, a system of underwater caves and trenches about 600 miles east of the Philippines. Naval intelligence had picked up strange acoustic signatures in the area, patterns that didn't match any known submarine propulsion systems or natural phenomena, and they wanted eyes on whatever was generating them. The mission was classified at the highest levels, the kind of operation where even acknowledging it existed would get you disappeared into a black site somewhere. What they didn't tell the team during the briefing was that this was actually the 4th expedition to the Serpent's Cradle in the past 18 months, and none of the previous teams had returned with usable intelligence. They'd spent 3 days traveling to the location, the submarine running silent and deep, everyone on edge, even though they hadn't encountered any hostile forces. Garrett said there was something wrong about the area even before they arrived. The way the sonar screens would occasionally show shadows that disappeared when you looked directly at them. The way radio transmissions would sometimes pick up sounds that weren't quite words or static, but something in between. The submarine's crew was professional, but visibly nervous, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding the SEAL team's questions about what previous expeditions to the area had found. One sailor, a young sonar technician named Phillips, had pulled Garrett aside the night before the dive and told him that the Navy had sent 2 previous survey teams to map the Serpent's Cradle, and neither had come back. Not that they'd died or gotten lost, but that they'd simply vanished, stopped responding to communications mid-transmission, and when rescue teams were sent, they found the equipment floating empty, with no signs of struggle or malfunction. Phillips had shown Garrett something else too, sonar recordings from the previous expeditions that showed impossible things, objects moving through water at speeds no biological creature or mechanical vehicle could achieve, and worse, the recordings sometimes picked up what sounded like voices, human voices screaming in the depths where no humans should have been. Garrett had reported this to Lieutenant Brightwell, who'd shrugged it off as sailor superstitions and reminded them that they were SEALs, trained for exactly this kind of high-risk operation. But Garrett noticed that Brightwell's hand was shaking when he dismissed the concerns, and during the equipment checks that followed, the lieutenant triple-checked every piece of gear with an intensity that suggested he was more worried than he'd admitted. They spent the next day doing final preparations and reviewing dive procedures, planning to go down in 2 4-man teams with the lieutenant, supervising from the submarine's mini-sub that would transport them to depth. The dive was scheduled for midnight, because that's when the anomalous acoustic signatures were strongest. Whatever was down there in the Serpent's Cradle, apparently more active during certain tidal periods. Garrett said he'd done hundreds of dives in his career, everything from tropical reef reconnaissance to Arctic under-ice operations, and he'd never felt the kind of dread that settled over him as they prepared to enter the water that night. It wasn't normal pre-mission nerves. It was something deeper, more instinctual, like his hindbrain was screaming at him to abort and surface and never come back. But SEALs don't abort missions because of bad feelings, so at 23:40 hours, they entered the water through the submarine's lockout chamber, 4 operators per team descending into darkness that was absolute and crushing. Garrett was in Team Alpha with operators named Kenneth Ashford, Isaiah Vaughn, and Dominic Cross, while Team Bravo consisted of Wesley Crane, Mitchell Hayes, Oscar Sullivan, and Nathaniel Marks. Lieutenant Brightwell followed them down in the mini-sub, maintaining communications and coordinating the search pattern they'd planned. The descent took almost an hour, dropping from the submarine's depth of 400 feet to the target depth of 1,800 feet, well within the range of their closed-circuit rebreathers, but deeper than most recreational divers would ever attempt. The pressure at that depth is crushing, over 800 pounds per square inch, enough to kill you instantly if your equipment failed or you ascended too quickly. Garrett said the descent felt wrong from the start, the water temperature fluctuating wildly between freezing and surprisingly warm, and at several points during the drop, he'd felt currents that pushed against him with impossible force, like invisible hands trying to shove him back toward the surface. The Serpent's Cradle itself was unlike anything Garrett had seen in underwater geography, a massive system of caves and tunnels that descended even deeper into the ocean floor, walls made of black volcanic rock that absorbed their lights rather than reflecting them. The acoustic anomalies that had drawn the Navy's attention seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the cave system, a low-frequency thrumming that you could feel in your chest rather than hear properly. Lieutenant Brightwell had positioned the mini-sub at the cave entrance and directed the teams to explore the first 100 meters of tunnel, collect samples, and report anything unusual. Simple directives, Garrett said, but every instinct he had was telling him to turn around and swim away as fast as possible, to get back to the submarine and convince the captain to torpedo this entire area until it was just rubble and dead water. Kenneth had made a joke to lighten the mood, something about how this cave system looked like the world's worst water slide, but nobody had laughed, the tension too thick for humor to penetrate. Team Alpha took the left tunnel while Team Bravo went right, both teams maintaining visual contact through a buddy line system and regular radio checks every 5 minutes. The tunnel was narrow enough that they had to swim single file, Garrett in third position behind Kenneth and Isaiah, with Dominic bringing up the rear. The walls were covered in some kind of biological growth that their lights showed as black and fibrous, almost hair-like in texture, waving slowly in the current, despite there being no current that deep. Garrett said he'd touched one of the growths with his gloved hand, and it had contracted instantly, wrapping around his finger before he could pull away, and he'd had to cut himself free with his dive knife. When he examined the stuff that had wrapped around him, he said it looked organic, but wrong somehow. Cells that didn't have nuclei or recognizable structure, just this amorphous black tissue that seemed to move on its own even after being severed. He'd tried to collect a sample in one of their specimen containers, but the tissue had dissolved the moment it was isolated, turning into a dark liquid that stained the container's interior. They'd been in the tunnel for maybe 15 minutes when Kenneth, their point man, suddenly stopped swimming and held up a closed fist, the signal for immediate halt. Everyone froze, checking their surroundings for whatever threat had been identified. Kenneth was using his light to illuminate something ahead in the tunnel, something that didn't belong in any natural cave system. It was a structure, clearly artificial, made of metal that should have corroded away centuries ago, but was still intact despite being at 1,800 feet of depth. The structure was roughly dome-shaped, maybe 20 feet in diameter, covered in strange markings that weren't any language Garrett recognized. He'd studied languages as part of his SEAL training, could identify most major writing systems, but these symbols were something else entirely. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift when you weren't focusing on them. Isaiah had moved closer to examine the markings and suddenly jerked backward, his voice coming through the comm system in a panic saying that the symbols had moved, had actually rearranged themselves in response to his approach. Lieutenant Brightwell's voice came through their comm system asking what they'd found, and Kenneth described the structure as best he could. There was a long pause before Brightwell responded, telling them to proceed with extreme caution, take photos and video, but don't attempt to enter or interact with the structure directly. The lieutenant's voice had a quality to it that Garrett couldn't quite identify, not fear exactly, but something close to it, like recognition, like Brightwell had been expecting them to find something like this. They'd moved closer, Kenneth using his camera to document everything while Isaiah checked for radiation or chemical hazards with their portable sensors. The sensors were going crazy, Garrett said, showing readings that didn't make sense, electromagnetic fields that were orders of magnitude stronger than should have been possible naturally, and a low-level radiation signature that was definitely not background. The strange thing was that the radiation wasn't consistent. It pulsed in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, like Morse code, but in a language nobody could decipher. Isaiah had reported these findings to Brightwell, who'd ordered them to back away from the structure and prepare for immediate extraction. But before they could begin their exit, something changed. The low-frequency thrumming that they'd been feeling since entering the cave system suddenly intensified, becoming almost painful, vibrating through their bodies and equipment. Garrett said it felt like being inside a massive speaker, the pressure waves strong enough to make his vision blur and his teeth ache. Then the structure began glowing, a pale bioluminescent blue that illuminated the entire tunnel with light that seemed to come from inside the metal itself. The symbols on its surface were moving now, definitely moving, rearranging themselves into new patterns, like some kind of equation being constantly solved and resolved. Kenneth had started swimming backward away from the structure, and the rest of Team Alpha followed, but they'd only made it a few meters when Isaiah's voice came through the comm in a panic, shouting that something was wrong with his rebreather, that he couldn't breathe properly, that his chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside. Garrett turned to help Isaiah and saw that his friend's rebreather was functioning perfectly, the gauges showing normal oxygen levels and carbon dioxide scrubbing. But Isaiah was clearly in distress, clawing at his mask and making choking sounds, even though his equipment showed no malfunction. Kenneth and Garrett had moved to either side of him, trying to calm him down and check his gear, when they noticed something horrifying. There was something inside Isaiah's mask with him, something that definitely hadn't been there seconds ago. It looked like black water, not quite liquid but not quite gas, flowing in through the edges of his mask despite it being sealed properly. Isaiah was inhaling this substance, and wherever it touched his skin, it left marks, dark stains spreading across his face like frostbite or chemical burns. Dominic had grabbed his arm trying to stabilize him, while Garrett tried to figure out what was happening. But the black substance was spreading faster now, not just on Isaiah's face but down his neck, visible through the collar of his wetsuit. They'd tried to remove his mask to clear whatever was contaminating his breathing system, but the moment Kenneth touched the mask, it shattered, just fell apart into fragments despite being made of reinforced polycarbonate that should have withstood incredible pressure. Isaiah's face was fully exposed to the water now, no protection at 1,800 feet of depth, and by all logic, he should have died instantly from the pressure differential. But he didn't die. He just kept thrashing and screaming silently in the water, his mouth open impossibly wide, wider than human jaw structure should allow, and that black substance was pouring into him, filling him from the inside out. Garrett said he could see it moving under Isaiah's skin, spreading through his body like ink in water, tracing the path of his veins and arteries, and Isaiah's eyes had changed color, no longer brown, but completely black, including the whites, just solid black orbs that stared at nothing and everything simultaneously. Lieutenant Brightwell was shouting through the comm system, demanding to know what was happening, but none of them could form coherent responses. They were all frozen in horror watching their team member transform into something that wasn't human anymore. Kenneth was trying to report the situation, but could only manage broken fragments of words, and Garrett realized that his own voice wasn't working either, that the thrumming from the structure had intensified to the point where it was interfering with their ability to speak or think clearly. Then Isaiah had stopped thrashing and gone completely still, suspended in the water in a position that should have been impossible to maintain naturally, perfectly horizontal and motionless, despite the slight current. For maybe 3 seconds nothing happened. Just Isaiah floating there with his black eyes and that substance visibly moving under his skin like thousands of tiny worms writhing beneath the surface. Then he'd turned his head toward Garrett, moved with a speed that no human neck could safely handle, a full 180-degree rotation that should have broken his spine, and smiled. Garrett emphasized this part when telling me the story, made me understand that what he saw wasn't Isaiah anymore, that whatever was wearing his friend's body was something else entirely, something ancient and hungry and utterly alien to human existence. The smile was wrong in ways that were hard to articulate, too wide and showing too many teeth. Teeth that hadn't been there before, sharp and irregular like a shark's mouth. Isaiah, or the thing controlling Isaiah, had opened its mouth, and Garrett could see that the inside was completely black, no tongue or throat visible, just an abyss that seemed to go on forever. Then it had spoken, not through the comm system, but somehow directly into their heads, a voice that was layered and echoing and made from sounds that shouldn't be possible for human vocal cords to produce. It said that they shouldn't be here, that this place was sealed for their protection as much as its imprisonment, that by activating the structure they'd broken ancient protocols and now consequences were inevitable. Kenneth had grabbed Garrett and Dominic and began pulling them back toward the cave entrance, leaving Isaiah floating there in front of the structure. It was the hardest decision any of them had ever made, abandoning a team member, but they all knew Isaiah was gone, that trying to retrieve him would just mean losing more people to whatever had taken him. They'd made it maybe 30 feet when they heard Isaiah moving behind them, not swimming but moving through the water in a way that should have been physically impossible, jerking and stuttering like a film with frames missing. They'd looked back and seen him pursuing them, moving faster than any human could swim even with fins, his body contorting in ways that should have broken bones, arms bending backward at the elbows, head rotating too far, legs kicking at angles that made no anatomical sense. That black substance was leaking from his eyes and mouth, leaving trails in the water that glowed with the same blue bioluminescence as the structure, and wherever the trails touched the cave walls, the black hair-like growth would writhe and reach toward them. Garrett had been the last in line during their retreat, meaning he was closest to whatever Isaiah had become, and he'd watched in absolute terror as their former teammate closed the distance with supernatural speed. He'd drawn his dive knife, the only weapon they carried besides small arms that would be useless underwater, and prepared to fight something he knew he couldn't win against. Isaiah, or the thing wearing him, got close enough that Garrett could see details he wished he couldn't. The way the skin was stretching and tearing as whatever was inside tried to accommodate itself to human biology. The way additional eyes were opening across its body wherever the black substance had spread. Eyes that weren't human eyes, but something more primitive and predatory. Just before Isaiah reached them, Team Bravo's voice came through the comm system. Mitchell Hayes screaming that they'd found something in their tunnel, that they needed immediate extraction, that everyone needed to get out now, that the walls were moving and there were things in the walls and oh God, they were coming out. The urgency in Hayes' voice must have gotten through to whatever was controlling Isaiah, because the thing stopped its pursuit and turned back toward the structure, moving away from them with the same impossible speed. Garrett said he watched Isaiah's body contort one final time before disappearing back into the glowing blue light, and he could have sworn he saw his friend's actual face for just a moment, breaking through whatever was possessing him, and the expression was one of pure agony and pleading, like Isaiah was still conscious somewhere inside that nightmare and begging them to kill him. Lieutenant Brightwell had ordered both teams to abort the mission and return to the mini-sub immediately. Forget the samples and documentation, just get out. Team Alpha had started ascending, following their guideline back toward the cave entrance, when the entire system suddenly flooded with that same pale blue bioluminescence. Every surface was glowing now, the walls, the strange hair-like growth, even the water itself seemed to be lit from within, and Garrett could see things moving in the walls that he'd thought were solid rock. The walls weren't solid at all, he realized. They were honeycombed with thousands of small chambers, each one containing something that looked vaguely humanoid but wrong, Wrong in the way that Isaiah had been wrong, bodies suspended in some kind of fluid or stasis, and they were all starting to wake up. Garrett could see eyes opening in those chambers, black eyes like Isaiah's, and the chambers were beginning to crack open, releasing whatever had been sleeping inside for who knows how long. Kenneth had seen it too, and was screaming at everyone to swim faster, that they needed to reach the entrance before whatever was waking up got free. They'd reached the cave mouth and found the mini-sub waiting, Lieutenant Brightwell gesturing frantically for them to board, his face visible through the sub's viewport showing an expression of controlled panic. Kenneth and Dominic made it inside, but as Garrett was grabbing the entry handle, he'd looked back into the cave one last time and immediately wished he hadn't. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Images that would play on repeat during every nightmare, every moment of paranoia, every time he closed his eyes. The entire cave system was visible now in that blue light, and it went down much deeper than they'd thought, kilometers down into the ocean floor. And the tunnels weren't natural at all. They were corridors, architecture, a massive underground structure that stretched impossibly far in all directions. And moving through those corridors were things that looked vaguely human-shaped, but wrong in fundamental ways, swimming or crawling or moving through dimensions that Garrett couldn't fully perceive. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all heading toward the cave entrance, toward the surface, toward escape. Some of them looked fresh, recently transformed, still wearing remnants of military gear from various eras and nations. Others looked ancient, their bodies adapted to the depths in ways that had nothing to do with human evolution, with additional limbs and organs that served purposes Garrett couldn't guess at. He'd realized in that moment that they hadn't been sent to investigate an anomaly. They'd been sent to check whether something was breaking out, whether the containment that had held these things for however long was finally failing. He'd scrambled into the mini-sub, and Brightwell had sealed the hatch, beginning immediate ascent while radioing the submarine to prepare for emergency retrieval and possible hostile contact. Through the mini-sub's portholes, they could see the cave entrance glowing brighter and brighter. And then the first of those things emerged into open water, moving with purpose toward the submarine's position 400 feet above. Brightwell was piloting the mini-sub as fast as it would go, racing against whatever was pursuing them, and Garrett could hear something impacting the hull, not like debris but like deliberate strikes, something testing the structure's strength, trying to find weak points. Kenneth had been looking through the rear porthole and he'd started screaming. Not words, just this raw sound of absolute terror that Garrett had never heard from a fellow SEAL. And when Garrett looked, he'd seen faces pressed against the glass, human faces with black eyes and mouths open too wide, dozens of them surrounding the mini-sub. And he'd recognized some of them, seen people he knew, sailors from previous expeditions based on their gear, all of them transformed into whatever Isaiah had become. One face in particular stood out, a woman wearing the remains of a French naval uniform from what looked like the 1960s, her name tag still partially visible reading Bernier. She'd been pressing her face against the porthole and mouthing words that Garrett couldn't hear but could somehow understand anyway, warning them that they couldn't stop what was coming, that the seals were broken and the deep ones were waking, and humanity's time on the surface was measured in decades at most. The mini-sub had docked with the submarine in record time, everyone scrambling through the lockout chamber while Brightwell was shouting at the captain to blow ballast and surface immediately, that they had hostiles in pursuit and needed to evacuate the area at maximum speed. They'd barely cleared the chamber when the submarine began its emergency ascent, angle so steep that loose equipment was sliding across the deck, alarms blaring as the reactor pushed beyond normal operating parameters to give them the speed they needed to outrun whatever was chasing them. Garrett and Kenneth and Dominic were stripping off their dive gear when they'd heard impacts against the submarine's hull, dozens of them, hundreds, the whole vessel shuddering from the strikes like it was being hit by torpedoes. But these weren't explosions. These were physical impacts from something ramming the hull with enough force to dent reinforced steel. Something was trying to get in, trying to breach the hull through sheer force, and the metallic groaning suggested it might succeed. The captain had ordered the submarine to full speed ahead while still ascending, trying to outrun whatever was chasing them, and crew members were running to battle stations even though nobody knew what they were supposed to fight. Phillips, the sonar technician, was at his station calling out contacts, hundreds of them surrounding the submarine and matching its speed despite it traveling at over 30 knots. Shapes on the sonar that moved like dolphins, but were the size of small whales and radiated heat. Signatures that made no biological sense. The submarine's executive officer, a commander named Dalton, had approached the SEAL team and asked point blank what the hell was chasing them, what had they found down there, and when nobody could answer coherently, he'd grabbed Kenneth by his wetsuit and demanded to know if they'd somehow started a war, if they'd attacked some foreign installation, and now they were all going to die for it. Kenneth had just laughed, a sound that was more hysteria than humor, and told Dalton that they wished it was that simple, that they wished they were being chased by Chinese or Russian submarines, because at least that would make sense within their understanding of reality. What was actually chasing them, Kenneth said, was so far outside normal experience that trying to fight it would be like cavemen trying to fight a nuclear missile with stone spears. Dalton had looked like he wanted to argue, but then another massive impact hit the hull, this time strong enough to knock several crew members off their feet, and he'd run back to the command center to coordinate damage control. They'd broken the surface after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The submarine's sail rising into the night air, waves crashing across the deck. The captain had immediately radioed for air support and prepared to evacuate the vessel if necessary, convinced that they were about to be sunk by whatever was down there. But the impacts had stopped the moment they surfaced, the things apparently unwilling or unable to follow them into the air. Team Bravo had finally made it back during the emergency ascent, all four of them accounted for but in various states of shock, none of them able to speak coherently about what they'd seen in their tunnel. Wesley Crane had been catatonic, staring at nothing and making strange movements with his hands like he was trying to communicate in a sign language nobody recognized. Mitchell Hayes had been whispering about eggs, thousands of eggs in chambers that were hatching, releasing things that had been waiting in darkness for so long they'd forgotten what light looked like. Oscar Sullivan had been relatively functional, but kept insisting that something had followed him back, that he could feel it inside his head, watching through his eyes, learning about the surface world through his memories. The submarine had remained on the surface running at maximum speed away from the Serpent's cradle, and after 2 hours of distance, the crew had finally started to believe they might have escaped. The captain had ordered a full diagnostic of the hull damage, and engineers reported that they'd counted over 300 distinct impact points, some of them showing strange corrosion patterns that hadn't been there before the dive, metal that looked like it had been partially digested by some kind of acid. More disturbing were the markings around some of the impact points, scratches that almost looked like writing, the same geometric symbols they'd seen on the structure in the cave, as if whatever had been hitting the hull was trying to communicate or mark the submarine for future reference. The captain had ordered all external surfaces photographed and documented before having them sandblasted clean, not wanting whatever message had been left to remain on his vessel. That's when Isaiah Vaughn had climbed onto the submarine's deck, pulling himself up from the water with movements that were still wrong, still too fast and too angular. He'd been 2 hours behind them at flank speed, which should have been impossible for any swimmer even with military fins and training, but there he was, standing on the sail in soaking wet dive gear, smiling at the lookouts who were screaming for help. Garrett said they'd tried to bring Isaiah inside, thinking maybe he'd somehow survived and escaped from whatever had taken him, but Lieutenant Brightwell had stopped them, had drawn his sidearm and ordered everyone to stay back from the thing that looked like their teammate. Brightwell asked Isaiah a series of questions, personal details that only the real Isaiah would know, names of family members and hometown details and memories from their training, and the thing answered everyone perfectly, had all of Isaiah's memories and personality apparently intact, but Brightwell kept his weapon trained on it anyway, told it that they knew it wasn't Isaiah anymore, that they'd seen what happened to him down in the caves, that whatever was wearing his body needed to leave immediately, or he'd be forced to take action. The thing wearing Isaiah's face had stopped smiling then, had looked at all of them with an expression that Garrett described as disappointed, like a teacher who'd expected better from students who should have known the lesson already. Then it had spoken, but not with Isaiah's voice, with multiple voices layered over each other, speaking in perfect unison but slightly out of sync, creating this awful echo effect that made everyone who heard it feel physically ill, nauseated and disoriented, like the sounds were doing something to their inner ear or brain chemistry. It said that they'd made a mistake coming here, that the Serpent's cradle had been sealed for reasons they couldn't comprehend, sealed by people long dead who'd understood what lived in those depths and what would happen if it ever got free. It said that by entering the caves and activating the structures inside, they'd broken containment protocols that had been maintained for thousands of years, protocols that involved sacrifices and rituals and knowledge that had been deliberately erased from human history because it was too dangerous for anyone to possess. The thing explained that what they called the Deep Ones weren't invaders or aliens or demons. They were the original owners of Earth, the species that had evolved in the oceans billions of years before life crawled onto land, and they'd been here. Through every extinction event and ice age and tectonic shift, adapting and surviving while everything else died. Humanity was a temporary phenomenon in their perspective, a blink of geological time, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the long arc of planetary history. The Deep Ones had chosen to retreat into dormancy millennia ago, when the last ice age made the surface world temporarily inhospitable, sealing themselves in the deep trenches and caves to wait for conditions to improve. But they'd left behind guardians and fail-safes, ways to monitor the surface world and ensure that no species stumbled upon their resting places and accidentally triggered an early awakening. The structures in the serpent's cradle were supposed to be impossible to find, surrounded by geographic and psychic barriers that would turn away anyone who got close. But modern human technology had become sophisticated enough to pierce those barriers, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Lieutenant Brightwell had asked what the Deep Ones wanted, what they would do now that they were waking up, and the thing had laughed with Isaiah's mouth, but a sound that came from something infinitely old and cruel, a sound that had harmonics no human voice could produce. It said that the Deep Ones weren't trying to wipe out humanity, they were trying to recruit us, to offer us a choice between extinction and transcendence. The black substance that had filled Isaiah wasn't killing him, it was changing him, rewriting his biology at a cellular level to allow him to survive in environments that would kill baseline humans, underwater pressure that would crush steel, temperatures that would boil or freeze normal tissue, radiation levels that would break DNA apart. The transformation was a gift in the Deep One's perspective, a chance for humanity to transcend its limitations and join them in the depths, to become part of something older and greater and more enduring than surface civilization had ever been. Anyone who accepted the transformation would gain access to knowledge and experiences beyond human comprehension, would live for centuries or millennia instead of decades, would be able to explore the 95% of Earth's oceans that humanity had never seen. But the offer came with conditions, the thing said, its voice taking on a more serious tone. Once transformed, there was no going back, no returning to baseline humanity or surface life. The changes were permanent and fundamental, affecting not just the body, but the mind and soul if such things existed. Transformed humans would have to make choices about what they were willing to give up, what parts of their humanity they could sacrifice in exchange for survival and power. Some transformed individuals retained most of their personality and memories, becoming ambassadors between the surface world and the depths. Others lost themselves completely, their human consciousness subsumed by the vastly older intelligence of the Deep Ones, becoming vessels for something alien wearing human skin. There was no way to predict which outcome any individual would experience, making the choice to accept transformation essentially a gamble with your identity and sanity as the stakes. Garrett had asked the obvious question, what happened to people who refused the transformation, who wanted to stay human and live on the surface? The thing wearing Isaiah's body had turned its black eyes directly on Garrett when answering, and he'd felt like he was being examined by something that could see through his skull into his thoughts, evaluating him as a specimen. It said that refusal was allowed, even respected in a way, but it came with its own consequences. The Deep Ones would be reclaiming the oceans over the next few decades, making them increasingly inhospitable to baseline humans through changes in temperature, acidity, and the introduction of organisms that would make the water toxic to surface life. Coastal areas would become dangerous, then uninhabitable, and eventually, the rising sea levels would force humanity to retreat further and further inland. Anyone who chose to remain human would be confined to an ever-shrinking habitable zone, cut off from the majority of the planet, watching as the oceans became completely alien territory. It wouldn't be genocide, the thing insisted, just natural selection, the universe favoring species that could adapt over those that couldn't. Lieutenant Brightwell had listened to all of this with growing horror and rage, and when the thing finished speaking, he'd asked point-blank if there was any way to stop what was coming, any way to reseal the Deep Ones or prevent their awakening. The thing had smiled again, that too wide smile showing too many teeth, and said that theoretically yes, there were methods that could work. ancient rituals and weapons that had been used before when the Deep Ones had woken prematurely. But those methods required knowledge that humanity had lost, artifacts that had been deliberately destroyed or hidden, and sacrifices that no modern person would be willing to make. The people who'd sealed the Deep Ones last time had been a coalition of ancient civilizations working together, Atlantis and Lemuria, and others whose names were lost to history, and they'd paid a terrible price to contain the threat. Entire cities sacrificed as anchors for the sealing rituals, millions of people giving their lives willingly to protect future generations. Modern humanity was too divided, too skeptical, too unprepared to mount that kind of coordinated response, which meant the seals would continue failing and the Deep Ones would continue rising, and within a generation or two the world would be fundamentally transformed. The thing had started to say something else, but Brightwell hadn't let it finish, had fired 3 rounds center mass into the thing wearing Isaiah's body, and it had fallen backward off the submarine into the dark water below. Everyone had rushed to the rail expecting to see a body floating in the waves, but there was nothing. Isaiah, or whatever had been controlling him, had simply disappeared beneath the surface without a trace. They'd maintained watch for hours, but never saw it again. And eventually the submarine had dived and continued its journey back to base. Everyone aboard understanding that they'd encountered something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality and humanity's place in the world. The trip back took 5 days, and during that time several strange things happened that reinforced how badly they'd messed up by entering the Serpent's cradle. The submarine's systems kept malfunctioning in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Electronics failing and restarting without cause, depth gauges showing impossible readings like they were simultaneously at multiple depths, and the reactor temperature fluctuating in patterns that violated basic physics. More disturbing were the crew members who started reporting strange dreams, nightmares about drowning or being pulled into darkness, but the details were too consistent across people who hadn't talked to each other, suggesting something was actively inserting these images into their sleeping minds. 3 sailors had to be sedated after waking up screaming about eggs hatching in their lungs, about black water filling them from the inside, about voices speaking languages that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The ship's doctor had examined them and found nothing physically wrong, no fever or infection or neurological damage, but their terror was real, and their descriptions matched too closely to what the SEAL team had seen in the caves. By the time they reached port, almost half the crew was exhibiting some level of psychological distress, and the Navy had to bring in psychiatric teams to evaluate everyone before they could be released back to regular duty. The SEAL team was immediately separated from the submarine crew and taken to a secure facility where they were debriefed extensively over the course of 3 weeks, hours, and hours of questioning in rooms with no windows and guards who watched their every movement. They were interviewed separately and together, asked to repeat their stories dozens of times looking for inconsistencies or signs that they were coordinating false testimony. But everyone's account matched on the key details: the structure with the moving symbols, Isaiah's transformation, the things in the walls waking up, the impossible journey back to the submarine. The debriefers included intelligence officers and scientists, and people whose credentials weren't explained, but who asked extremely technical questions about the Deep One's biology and technology. Garrett said he got the strong impression that the Navy already knew about the Deep Ones, that this wasn't the first encounter, and they were using the team's testimony to fill in gaps in existing knowledge, rather than learning about the threat for the first time. Of course, they had a lot of questions, Garrett said, but no matter how many they asked, they weren't getting satisfying answers back from the debriefers. They were simply told to wait, to be patient, that decisions were being made at levels far above their pay grade about what would happen next and how the government would respond to this situation. They spent their days in a kind of limbo, confined to barracks with nothing to do but play cards and work out and avoid thinking about what they'd seen. Team Bravo was housed in a different building and they weren't allowed to interact, which worried Garrett because he'd heard that Wesley Crane had completely stopped speaking and Oscar Sullivan had attempted suicide twice during the debriefing period, convinced that something was still inside him, watching and waiting and growing stronger as time passed. After 3 weeks, each member of the SEAL team was questioned individually by men in suits. CIA agents Garrett assumed, though they never confirmed their affiliation. The agents had detailed files on each operator, knowing things about their families and backgrounds that should have been private, making it clear that they'd done extensive research and had leverage if they needed it. Garrett's interviewer was a man who introduced himself simply as Miller. middle-aged with gray hair, and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he'd seen and done things that would break most people. Miller had been direct, explaining that what happened in the Serpent's Cradle was being classified at the highest possible level, that the operation would be erased from all official records, and that everyone involved would be required to sign agreements promising never to speak about it to anyone, ever, for any reason. The penalty for violating these agreements would be immediate arrest and indefinite detention in a facility where due process didn't apply, where people could be held forever without trial or charges or even acknowledgement that they existed. But Miller had also offered compensation for their cooperation, Garrett said. Substantial financial compensation that would ensure they never had to work again if they didn't want to. The exact amount varied based on rank and time in service, but for Garrett it was $11,000 per year, adjusted for inflation, paid monthly for the rest of his life, as long as he remained silent about Operation Serpent's Cradle. Miller had explained this wasn't hush money exactly. It was recognition that what they'd experienced had traumatized them in ways that would make normal reintegration difficult, and the government wanted to ensure they had the resources to deal with that trauma privately rather than publicly. Garrett had tried to get more information out of Miller, asking what the government planned to do about the Deep Ones, whether they were taking the threat seriously, whether there was any plan to protect humanity from what was coming. Miller had given him a look that was almost pitying, and said that yes, there were plans, classified plans that involved international cooperation and scientific research and military preparation, but that Garrett shouldn't expect those plans to be shared with someone at his level. When Garrett had pressed for more details, Miller had finally admitted something that chilled him more than anything else. He'd said that the government had known about the Deep Ones for decades, that the first confirmed encounter had been in 1963 during a submarine expedition in the Mariana Trench, and that every expedition since then had found more evidence of their existence and gradual awakening. The SEALs were failing all over the world, not just at the Serpent's Cradle, and monitoring stations had detected increased activity at dozens of sites where the Deep Ones were believed to be sleeping. The government's best estimates suggested that full awakening would occur sometime between 2030 and 2050, at which point humanity would have to make collective choices about how to respond, whether to fight, flee, or accept the transformation that was being offered. But publicly acknowledging any of this would cause mass panic and societal collapse, so the policy was containment and preparation, keeping the truth hidden while quietly building infrastructure and capabilities that might be needed when the crisis finally became undeniable. Garrett had asked Miller point-blank whether he believed humanity had any chance of surviving what was coming. Miller had been silent for a long moment, studying Garrett's face, and then he'd said something that Garrett would remember for the rest of his life. He'd said that survival was definitely possible, but it would require sacrifices and changes that most people weren't ready to make. And the humanity that survived would be so fundamentally different from what we were now that it raised philosophical questions about whether survival even meant anything if we had to become monsters to achieve it. The Deep Ones weren't offering humanity a choice between life and death. They were offering a choice between different kinds of existence, and nobody really knew which option was better or more moral or worth fighting for. Miller himself wasn't sure what he'd do when the time came, whether he'd accept transformation, or fight to remain human, or just walk into the ocean and let it end quickly, and he respected whatever choice Garrett eventually made. After that conversation, Garrett had been given his discharge papers and sent home with a thick folder of documents he needed to sign, all of them variations on the theme of, "You will never speak about this to anyone for any reason." He'd signed everything, taken his first payment, and tried to figure out how to build a life after experiencing things that most people couldn't even imagine. For the first few months he'd attempted normality, dating and socializing and pretending he was just another veteran adjusting to civilian life. But the surveillance had started almost immediately, faces in water watching him, reminding him that the Deep Ones knew who he was and where he lived, and that they could reach him anytime they chose. He'd tried therapy, but couldn't talk about the real source of his trauma. Tried medication, but it just numbed him without providing real relief. Tried exercise and work and every other coping mechanism before finally admitting that he couldn't live anywhere near large bodies of water without constant panic attacks. That's when he'd moved to Montana, as far from the ocean as he could get while still remaining in the United States, to this isolated cabin where he could control his water exposure and minimize the opportunities for surveillance. The move had helped, he said. The lack of lakes and rivers in his immediate area meant he went days sometimes without seeing faces in reflections, could almost convince himself that maybe the Deep Ones had forgotten about him. But they never forgot. He'd learned that over the years, they just chose when to remind him of their presence, strategically timed appearances that seemed designed to prevent him from getting too comfortable or believing he'd actually escaped. The worst had been during a rare trip to town for supplies, when he'd stopped to wash his hands in a gas station bathroom and seen Isaiah's face looking up at him from the sink drain, mouthing words Garrett could somehow understand. "Soon, brother. Soon you'll join us in the dark water." Kenneth had lasted 5 years before the Deep Ones collected him, Garrett said, returning to his original story, but adding details he hadn't shared initially. Kenneth had been part of the classified program studying the Deep Ones, working directly with scientists who were trying to understand their biology and technology, and he'd learned things that made him increasingly convinced that humanity's only real option was accepting transformation and hoping enough of our personality survived to make the trade worthwhile. He'd started advocating for voluntary transformation programs, controlled circumstances where people could choose to become like Isaiah while minimizing the risk of losing themselves completely. The program had actually started implementing Kenneth's recommendations, recruiting volunteers and attempting transformations in laboratory settings, but the results were catastrophic. None of the subjects retained enough humanity to be useful as ambassadors. They all became completely subsumed by the Deep One consciousness and had to be terminated. Kenneth had been devastated by these failures, blamed himself for the deaths of people he'd convinced to volunteer, and started having psychological breakdowns that made his colleagues question whether he should remain in the program. That's when Kenneth had started visiting Garrett in Montana, making trips every few months to talk to someone who'd shared the original experience and might understand what he was going through. During these visits, Kenneth would share classified information he shouldn't have, details about the transformation research and what they were learning about Deep One society and culture. According to Kenneth, the Deep Ones weren't a monolithic species, but a complex civilization with different factions and philosophies, some of them genuinely interested in coexistence with humanity, while others viewed us as nothing more than raw material for transformation experiments. The structures in the Serpent's Cradle weren't just seals, they were prisons containing the most aggressive faction of Deep Ones, the ones who'd wanted to wipe out surface life entirely, rather than offering the choice of transformation. By activating those structures, the SEAL team had potentially released the most dangerous elements of Deep One society, the ones who saw humanity as a threat to be eliminated, rather than a species to be recruited. Kenneth had also shared disturbing theories about why the SEALs were failing now specifically, suggestions that it wasn't just random deterioration, but deliberate sabotage from within human society. There were apparently people, organizations, maybe entire governments who were working to accelerate the Deep One's awakening, either because they'd already been transformed and were serving as agents, or because they'd been promised favorable treatment when the transformation became global. These collaborators had been systematically weakening the ancient SEALs through specific types of pollution, deep-sea mining, and submarine activities designed to look like normal human industrial expansion, but actually serving to degrade the containment systems that had held the Deep Ones for millennia. Kenneth had names and evidence, but wouldn't share specifics, said that knowing too much would make Garrett a target for the collaborators who were apparently very good at making people disappear or discrediting them into irrelevance. The last time Kenneth visited Montana had been in early 2009, showing up unannounced in the middle of winter when the roads were barely passable, looking haggard and paranoid in ways that alarmed even Garrett, who'd grown used to Kenneth's increasing instability. Kenneth had been convinced he was being followed, not just by the Deep Ones, but by human agents who wanted to silence him before he could expose the collaboration network. He'd brought with him a set of files, classified documents he'd stolen from the program, containing information he said humanity needed to know, even if it meant breaking every secrecy agreement he'd signed. The files detailed the transformation research in graphic detail, showed that the process was even worse than they'd initially understood, that accepting the black substance meant allowing something ancient and alien to literally rewrite your DNA and reshape your neurons until you were no longer the person who'd made the choice. Every successful transformation had resulted in the complete elimination of the original personality, replaced by something that wore their memories like a costume but operated on completely alien motivations and logic. Kenneth had wanted Garrett to help him leak these files to the press, create public awareness that might force the government to acknowledge the Deep One threat, and maybe slow down the collaborators who were working to accelerate their awakening. But Garrett had refused, too frightened of what the consequences might be for his family and for himself, and they'd argued badly, possibly the worst fight of their friendship. Kenneth had called him a coward, accused him of choosing comfort over humanity's survival, said that people like Garrett who knew the truth but remained silent were complicit in whatever happened when the Deep Ones fully awakened. Garrett had told Kenneth that going public would just get them both killed without actually helping anyone, that the collaborators were too powerful and too entrenched to be stopped by leaked documents, that the only rational choice was to protect yourself and your family, and accept that larger forces were beyond individual control. Kenneth had left that night in rage, taking his files with him, and Garrett never saw him alive again. 2 months later, Garrett had gotten a call from Miller, the CIA agent from his original debriefing, informing him that Kenneth had died in a drowning accident. The official story was that Kenneth had been swimming in his backyard pool, possibly intoxicated based on his erratic behavior in recent weeks, and had suffered some kind of medical event that caused him to lose consciousness underwater. The autopsy had been conclusive, Miller said, death by drowning with no signs of foul play or struggle. But Miller had also made a point of mentioning that Kenneth had been discovered with no water in his lungs, completely dry despite supposedly drowning, and that his body had shown markers consistent with extreme pressure exposure, like he'd been at the bottom of a trench, even though he'd been found in 5 feet of suburban pool water. Miller had asked if Garrett knew what Kenneth had been working on recently, whether he'd mentioned anything about stolen files or plans to go public with classified information, and Garrett had lied, said no, they'd barely been in contact recently. He had no idea what Kenneth had been involved in. After hanging up with Miller, Garrett had spent 3 days in a state of near catatonic fear, convinced that he'd be next, that the Deep Ones or the collaborators or the government would decide he was too much of a liability to leave alive. But nothing happened. Days turned into weeks, turned into months, and gradually he'd convinced himself that maybe lying about the files had saved him, that as long as he remained silent and cooperative, he'd be allowed to live out his exile in Montana. He'd heard about the other team members dying. Over the years, always through official channels that made the deaths sound mundane and unconnected, but he knew better, knew that the Deep Ones were systematically eliminating everyone who'd seen them in the Serpent's Cradle. Dominic had died in 2012, found in his bathtub with that same pattern of extreme pressure exposure despite being at sea level. Wesley Crane had died in 2011, his car found during a rainstorm with him inside, apparently drowned even though the vehicle was sealed. Mitchell Hayes had disappeared during a fishing trip in 2014, his boat found empty with no signs of what happened to him. By 2016, when Lieutenant Brightwell died during a routine physical fitness test, Garrett had realized he was likely the only member of Team Alpha still alive, and he'd spent the next years waiting for his turn, wondering what form his death would take and whether it would be quick or prolonged. The surveillance had intensified during this period, faces appearing more frequently in any water source he encountered. Sometimes Isaiah's face, sometimes Kenneth's, sometimes people he didn't recognize but who radiated the same wrongness, the same sense of being vessels for something ancient and inhuman. They never threatened him directly, just watched and waited and smiled, letting him know that they could take him whenever they chose, and that his continued survival was a courtesy that could be revoked at any moment. The psychological toll of living under that kind of constant threat had been devastating, Garrett admitted, worse than any combat stress or trauma from his military service, because at least in war, you could fight back or find cover or eventually go home. There was no home from the Deep Ones, no safety anywhere on a planet that was 95% ocean, no escape from creatures that could observe through any water source and move through dimensions humans couldn't perceive. Garrett had tried to find Nathaniel Marks during this period, the last surviving member of Team Bravo, who'd supposedly found some way to protect himself through extreme isolation in the Australian outback. But Marks had gone completely off-grid, no phone or email or any way to contact him, and Garrett's attempts to hire private investigators to locate him had all failed, with the investigators reporting back that they'd found no trace of anyone matching his description in Australia. Either Marks had died without anyone notifying the other survivors, or he'd found a way to become truly invisible, or possibly he'd accepted transformation and was now working for the Deep Ones while maintaining a fictional identity as a survivor. That uncertainty had added another layer of paranoia to Garrett's existence, wondering if any of the information Marks had shared about Deep One society and their plans had been disinformation designed to manipulate the survivors into specific behaviors or beliefs. The heart attack that finally brought Garrett down hadn't been natural, he'd told me in those final days. It was the result of nearly 2 decades of constant stress and hypervigilance, of never sleeping deeply or feeling truly safe, of maintaining a state of alertness that human bodies weren't designed to sustain indefinitely. His cardiovascular system had literally worn out from the chronic elevation of stress hormones and blood pressure that came from knowing that predators were watching him through every puddle and shower and rainstorm. The doctors had been confused by how rapidly his condition deteriorated, how aggressive the heart failure was for someone who didn't smoke or drink heavily or have family history of cardiac problems. But Garrett understood perfectly, had been expecting something like this for years, had actually been hoping that his body would give out before the Deep Ones decided to collect him directly. At least dying from heart failure meant he'd die as himself, as Garrett, rather than being transformed into one of those things swimming in the dark water. Except the Deep Ones weren't going to let him have even that small mercy, he'd realized during those final days in the cabin when his condition was deteriorating faster than the doctors predicted. They were speeding up his death somehow, draining his life force or manipulating his biology from a distance, ensuring that he'd die on their schedule rather than his own. He'd known this because of how often Isaiah's face had appeared in every water source, more frequent than ever before, and because of the water leaking from his body, even though he wasn't drinking much. Sweat and tears, and eventually blood that all smelled of deep ocean and contained traces of that black substance that had transformed Isaiah. His body was being prepared for transformation even as it was dying, the Deep Ones hedging their bets, ensuring that whether he died naturally or they claimed him forcibly, the result would be the same. Another vessel for their consciousness, another human who'd learned too much becoming a tool for their purposes. That's why Garrett had called me, he'd explained as his story wound down. Why he'd decided to break 19 years of silence and tell someone the truth despite the danger it posed to both of us. He wanted there to be a record, evidence that couldn't be completely erased, testimony from someone who'd seen the Deep Ones firsthand and understood what humanity was facing. If I could document his story and share it widely enough, make it reach enough people that it couldn't be suppressed or dismissed, then maybe it would plant seeds of awareness that would help when the crisis finally became undeniable. People would remember hearing about the Deep Ones before the official revelation, would have mental frameworks already in place for processing information that would otherwise seem insane, would be slightly more prepared to make the terrible choices that were coming. It wasn't much, Garrett admitted. Probably wouldn't change the ultimate outcome, but it was something, a small act of resistance against the inevitability of what was approaching. He'd also wanted me specifically to know because I was family, because he loved me, and couldn't bear the thought of me being caught completely unprepared when the waters rose and the transformations began. He'd given me detailed instructions on how to protect myself, techniques he'd developed over 19 years of survival, knowledge that might buy me a few extra years of human existence before I'd have to make my own choice about transformation or extinction. Stay away from large bodies of water, obviously, but also be careful with rainfall and condensation, with any water that sat still long enough for them to establish a connection. Drink only bottled water that was purchased sealed, never from the tap or wells that might be contaminated with that black substance. If you see faces and reflections, don't engage with them, don't acknowledge their presence, don't let them know you're aware of being watched, because attention seems to accelerate whatever process they use to target individuals. Move frequently if possible, never establishing patterns that they can predict, because they seem to have difficulty tracking people who maintain irregular routines and random schedules. Most importantly, Garrett had said, start building psychological resilience now, before the crisis becomes public, because when it does, the mental health impact on humanity will be catastrophic. People will have to choose between remaining human and facing extinction, or accepting transformation and losing their identity. And that choice will break millions of people who aren't prepared for it. Anyone who knows the truth beforehand and has time to process it will have an advantage, will be able to make more rational decisions instead of acting from panic and desperation. I needed to think seriously about what I valued most, Garrett had told me, whether I'd rather die as myself or survive as something else, whether I'd be willing to sacrifice my human consciousness to preserve some fragment of my personality in a transformed state. There were no right answers to these questions, no moral framework that could guide the decision, just personal values and priorities that each individual would have to determine for themselves. Garrett died that afternoon, slipping away quietly while I was in the next room making coffee, his heart finally giving out after decades of being pushed beyond its limits. When I came back to check on him, he was gone, his body still and peaceful, except for his eyes, which were open and staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute horror frozen on his face, mouth open impossibly wide, like he'd seen something in those final moments that had terrified him beyond anything he'd experienced in life. His mouth was leaking that dark water that smelled of salt and depth and things that had never seen sunlight, viscous and somehow warm despite the cool cabin air, pooling on his pillow and dripping down to stain the bedsheets black. I'd called for an ambulance but knew it was too late, knew that whatever had been hunting him for 19 years had finally collected its prize, that Garrett's consciousness might already be gone, uploaded or transferred or consumed by something that now wore his body like a discarded costume. The EMTs who arrived commented on how unusual it was to find water in his lungs, given that he'd died of heart failure in a landlocked cabin hundreds of miles from any ocean. They'd written it off as some kind of fluid buildup from his failing cardiovascular system, pulmonary edema perhaps, even though the volume and composition didn't match that diagnosis. I'd watched them load Garrett's body into the ambulance and noticed that one of the EMTs kept staring at his face with a strange expression, like recognition mixed with unease. And when I'd made eye contact with that EMT, I'd seen something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. They were too dark, darker than normal human eyes should be even in the dim cabin lighting, and when he'd smiled at me, it had been that same too-wide smile I'd seen in the photographs from Isaiah's transformation. The EMT knew what had happened to Garrett, was possibly one of them, possibly transformed himself and working in human society as an observer or agent. I'd backed away from the ambulance, and the EMT had just kept smiling, had even winked at me as they drove away with my uncle's body, and I'd understood that this was another message, another reminder that they were everywhere, and I was being watched, and there was nowhere I could hide that they couldn't eventually reach. The funeral was a week later, delayed because the medical examiner wanted to run additional tests on Garrett's body to understand the unusual fluid found in his lungs. They never released those test results publicly, but Miller called me before the funeral and mentioned casually that the fluid had been seawater, specifically seawater from depths below 5,000 feet, where the pressure and salinity and mineral content were different from surface oceans. He'd asked if I knew how seawater from the abyssal zone could have ended up in Garrett's lungs in a Montana cabin, asked if Garrett had said anything unusual before he died, anything that might explain these anomalous findings. I'd lied convincingly, said Garrett had been heavily medicated and mostly unconscious in those final days, hadn't said anything coherent at all, definitely hadn't mentioned anything about seawater or transformations or creatures from the deep. Miller had seemed to accept this, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe me, and he'd reminded me that if I ever needed to talk about anything at all, I should call him directly, rather than sharing information through less secure channels. The funeral itself was surreal, a small gathering of family members and old friends who'd drifted away from Garrett over the years, but felt obligated to attend. I'd given a brief eulogy that talked about his service and sacrifice without mentioning any specifics, and I'd watched my mother cry for the brother she'd lost decades ago, even though his body was only now being buried. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking a small stream that fed into a larger river system, and during the burial service I'd noticed the water looked strange, darker than it should be, and when I'd looked closely, I'd seen faces in the current, dozens of them, all watching the funeral, all smiling. Other attendees had noticed too, several people commenting on how the water looked polluted or contaminated, how it seemed to move against the natural flow patterns, but nobody connected these anomalies to anything supernatural or threatening. After everyone left, I'd stood alone at Garrett's grave for a long time, looking at the fresh earth and the temporary marker, and I'd noticed the ground around the burial site was wet, despite no rain having fallen, puddles forming in impossible places, and every puddle contained faces looking up at me with those black eyes and predatory smiles. That was 3 weeks ago, and since then, I've been experiencing everything Garrett described during his 19 years of isolation. The surveillance through water, the faces in reflections, the sense of being constantly watched by something ancient and hostile and infinitely patient. I've seen Isaiah's face in my bathroom mirror, Kenneth's face in rain puddles outside my apartment, faces I don't recognize in the condensation on windows, all of them watching me with that same expression of amused patience, like they're waiting for me to accept the inevitable and stop resisting what's coming. I've moved to a new apartment specifically chosen for being in the driest neighborhood I could find in Denver, but they still find me, still watch me, still remind me daily that nowhere is truly safe. I've tried to tell people about what Garrett told me, shared his story online under anonymous accounts, sent detailed emails to journalists and scientists and anyone who might take the threat seriously, but most dismiss it as creative fiction or grief-induced delusion, and the few who believe me are probably already on lists themselves, marked as people who know too much. The worst part isn't the surveillance itself, it's the knowledge that comes with it, understanding that everything Garrett warned about is true and accelerating. I've started noticing news articles about unusual ocean behavior, inexplicable temperature fluctuations, and species die-offs and acoustic anomalies that sound exactly like what the SEAL team encountered at the Serpent's Cradle. There are more reports of deep-sea equipment malfunctioning in ways that engineers can't explain, submarines detecting large objects moving at impossible speeds, oil drilling platforms abandoned after workers reported seeing things in the water that official statements attribute to hallucinations or group hysteria. The patterns are there for anyone willing to look, evidence of something massive waking up in the depths, preparing to reclaim a planet that had always belonged to them long before humans existed. And most terrifying of all, I've started noticing people in my daily life who show the subtle signs Garrett described, eyes that are slightly too dark, movements that are slightly too fluid, smiles that are slightly too wide. They're already among us, transformed individuals living in human society, working normal jobs and maintaining normal relationships while serving purposes that have nothing to do with human concerns. I don't know how much time I have before they decide to take me, like they took Garrett and Kenneth and Isaiah and everyone else who saw the deep ones and survived to talk about it. Maybe days, maybe years, maybe they'll let me live out a normal lifespan as a form of psychological torture, forcing me to watch humanity's slow decline into crisis while knowing exactly what's coming and being powerless to prevent it. I keep Garrett's instructions close, following his advice about water and patterns and psychological preparation, building mental resilience for choices I'll eventually have to make. Sometimes I wonder if I should just accept transformation now, get it over with while I still have some agency in the process, before they force it on me during some moment of weakness or desperation. But then I remember Isaiah's face in those final moments, before the black substance took him completely, the pure terror and pleading in his expression, and I know I'll fight to remain human for as long as possible, even knowing it's ultimately futile. If you've read this far and you're questioning whether any of it could be true, whether your ocean really does contain ancient intelligences preparing to reshape the world, I encourage you to look at any body of water near you. Really look at it, stare long enough for your eyes to adjust, and your mind to open to possibilities it normally rejects. If you see faces looking back at you with black eyes and too wide smiles, if you feel that sense of being observed by something vast and old and utterly inhuman, then congratulations, you're now one of us, one of the watched, one of the people who carry knowledge that will either prepare you for what's coming or drive you slowly insane before it arrives. Garrett spent 19 years running from the truth he'd discovered in the Serpent's Cradle, and it didn't save him in the end, didn't protect him from the transformation he'd feared more than death itself. None of us can run from what's coming. We can only choose how we face it when the waters finally rise and the deep ones emerge to claim the surface world they've been patiently waiting to inherit. When humanity's time as dominant species ends and we're offered the choice between extinction and becoming something that our current selves would consider worse than death. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.